Who is responsible for organizing our online society? Well, The Platform Society is a book that we've written, Thomas Boel, Martijn de Waal and myself, to explain how our society is organized in an online world, in a connective world. And what we've done in this book is that we've shown how our society, the various sectors in our society, have become almost completely dependent on big platforms like Facebook, Amazon, Google, Apple, Microsoft, the big five platforms that we're using the acronym GAFAM for. And we have shown how we have become almost completely dependent on the infrastructure that they have created. Not just the private sectors in our society, the way in which we transact, we do all kinds of transactions online these days, the way that we have organized our informal lives. We can no longer imagine that we have a life without Facebook or Instagram or Snapchat, and we're constantly dependent on these platforms for our transactions, for our communications, for our interaction online. And that not only is true for private sectors, such as urban transport, which is one of the sectors that we've researched, and news, for instance, our news consumption, but also public sectors, sectors like health or like education. So what we've been looking at in the book is how each of those four sectors have become dependent on platforms for their, for our everyday daily life. And let me give you a few examples from each of those sectors. For instance, in terms of news, for news consumption, we have become almost completely dependent on distributors like Facebook, like Instagram, like Twitter, for receiving our news, for our news consumption. In that way, platforms like Facebook have become an incredibly important force in our social lives. In, for instance, a sector like education, we have now in pretty much every classroom in America and in Europe, we're using software, hardware, or any kind of platform that is used in a school context has ties to one of these big platforms. So what we're seeing is that, for instance, Google is very present in a classroom, not just with, for instance, Chrome laptops, but along with those laptops comes software and comes, for instance, tracking systems or administrative systems that bring these platforms into the classroom. And a third example, of course, is from the health sector, where we see, we have an incredible growth of health and fitness platforms. Your mobile phone, for instance, can now measure your heartbeat or your steps, your everyday steps. And of course, there's hundreds and thousands of platforms that allow you to communicate with, for instance, patient communities. If you want to exchange your experiences as a patient, you can use a platform like Patients Like Me, or a lot of other platforms out there that help you, facilitate you to communicate about disease. In a sense, those platforms have been tremendous facilitators. They help us to engage with each other in our daily lives. They help connect us. They help connect us to news contents, and also to advertisements. On the other hand, what we're seeing is that those platforms are doing something else. They get in control of our daily activity by means of data flows. Because for many of those platforms, what we're doing is we're basically trading. We have a trade-off between we give away our data in exchange for convenience and services. So many of these services are free. We use them free of charge. We do not pay money for them, but we pay in another currency. And that currency is, of course, data. And the platforms that I just mentioned are in charge of so much data. So if you give away your data to a platform, and a platform can combine, for instance, your health data with your educational data or your interests, in what you're looking at on Facebook or on Instagram, they become tremendously knowledgeable about who you are, what you're interested in, what you can be sold, and they become, very powerful in collecting data in order to turn that into a personal profile. And that, of course, is a very valuable currency. So the big 5 platforms are now in charge of many of these data flows, and they can combine them. They can not only combine them in order to sell you goods or new services, etc., but they can also use those data and data flows as input for generating new knowledge, new analytical tools, and of course, if we think about artificial intelligence and the development of tools that are important for AI, these data are becoming, tremendously valuable for future input in developing these technologies. I think one of the biggest challenges that we're facing now, particularly in Europe, is how we are going to anchor public values in a connected world, in an online world that is increasingly, defined by how platforms organize that society. And by public values, I basically mean 2 things. One, I think there's a set of public values that we're all pretty familiar with by now that relates to privacy. We want our data to be private. We want them to be secure. That's another public value. We don't want them to be hacked. We don't want them to be used for other purposes. Transparency is another very important public value. And of course, we want it to be accurate. If we use a health platform, for instance, a heartbeat counter or a step counter, we want it to be accurate. But also think about news. We want news to be accurate, the news that we engage with. So those public values, security, safety, privacy, accuracy, transparency, those are very primary public values. But then we have another set of public values that pertain to not just to the internet itself, but to society as a whole. In each society, each nation, each national organization of democracy, we have to ask ourselves who is responsible for organizing our online society. And in many ways, it has become a lot more difficult because online platforms, which are globally organized, and in the American ecosystem, they are mostly organized from a Silicon Valley perspective, and they're corporations based in Silicon Valley. If we in Europe, for instance, become very much dependent on the platforms for organizing the democratic processes in our European countries, this becomes very tricky. Who is responsible, who is accountable for taking charge of these information flows? And that is, a battle that we have seen over the past few years. In organizing the democratic processes, Facebook has become an enormous mediator in a way. And a mediator that for European societies, for European nations, is very hard to control. And that is, I think, now what we're seeing is that there are a lot of challenges in Europe with, on the one hand, global corporations who are beyond their control, but who have a very important and very definite impact on local and national democratic processes. That is a huge challenge for Europe. How do we anchor those public values in an online society, part of which we are not in control of, how these systems are organized, because we do not own the corporations that are in charge of some of these important mechanisms. The scandals that we have seen over the past few years, and then I'm thinking about the Facebook Cambridge Analytica scandal, the data leaks that we have seen happening, of course they've had a big impact. I think before we were hardly aware of how important data flows are and the data flows that are generated through platforms and that become owned by big platform corporations. I think we had very little notion of what they do and to what effect they are used. Because of those scandals, that awareness has certainly grown, certainly in political circles. And what we have seen in 2018 is, for instance, in Washington and in Brussels, Mark Zuckerberg was called in to testify and was basically asked questions of responsibility, one of the public values I just mentioned. The question of, is Facebook responsible for big data leaks? Well, the answer here is, of course, obviously. But of course, Facebook is not the only one who is in charge in fixing those problems. And the big question is, are they able to fix problems that, they have partly caused, but partly the reason for the problems to exist is that you cannot fix the problems of a society if you outsource all the organization of that society to big corporations who are in charge of just, for instance, the distribution of news. So you really have to look at the mechanisms and the organization of a society in a way that allows you to see how democratic processes are anchored, how are they organized in a society, and what do these platforms do to disturb them in a way. In the case of fake news, for instance, Mark Zuckerberg was asked all kinds of questions. What is Facebook going to do about fake news, the distribution of fake news? Well, that's a complicated question because Facebook is not in charge of making the news, of producing the news. Every news organization are in charge of doing that, but also a lot of Russian trolls who are just making up news and throwing that into the news feed stream. Facebook, of course, is responsible for the distribution and therefore the selection of fake news. And that's where, they have promised to do better in, for instance, selecting which news items are fake and which are not in terms of their distribution responsibility. So, in fact, it's a shared responsibility. The solution to fake news is not to is not very simple. It's a shared responsibility between governments who have a responsibility to make sure they have a diverse media landscape. Facebook, who's one of the biggest news distributors right now, of course, news organization who are basically businesses trying to do their best, and of course also users who are to some extent responsible for what they consume and what they consider to be fake or real or trustworthy news. And the latter aspect is quite important because in a sense what you can require of news consumers is that they become more media literate, that they engage with news in a sense that allows them to see what is fake and what is not. But then you cannot expect from an ordinary consumer that he or she recognizes and can sort of validate every piece of news that he or she is seeing online. So this shared responsibility for the problem of fake news is in fact a very difficult issue to solve if you do not work from the idea that you share this responsibility in as sort of a cohesive society. Another problem that Facebook in this is facing is, of course, the problem of hate speech and the way that it's been distributed, across the globe and has caused very local problems. For instance, in Myanmar, in Brazil, and of course in Germany and Eastern Europe, the question of hate speech is it's not just a single issue. Hate speech is something that you need to resolve and need to reflect on on a national level or even a local level. And that is a level that Facebook, of course, has not been prepared for. It was prepared to grow as a global force, as a global, powerful force for connecting people. But part of that connecting people is to sort of scale down and make sure that at the local level and the national level, you understand the politics of discrimination, the politics of various groups fighting each other. Hate speech is something that you need to contextualize. And what we've been seeing in the global perspective of platformization is that there's a lot of attention for scaling up, but not for scaling down. Of course, it's to Facebook's advantage that they've scaled up their operability, of course, to such an extent that they can now operate as a global company. But on the other hand, this may be Facebook's biggest challenge, is to scale down and to get back from that global level of operation to the very idea of operating in a society where they're a responsible actor in a society. And that society is not a global society. That is not an entity that exists. But Facebook plays an important role in also in fixing the problems of public values in an online world.